Oh, thank you, Lowndes, very much. That's really good. There's all kinds of good ant puns out there. So first off, can you see this slide?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you again very much for asking me to talk to you about ants. Even though my job is focused on fire, I could literally talk for hours and days about ants, and sometimes I have, because they really got me into studying biology. Because when I was a kid, I would eat ants and I wanted to know more about them. And so just this presentation is only going to just skim the surface of what really makes them cool and important for us and important for the world. So yes, it is a complex world under your feet. So first off, general information about ants. There's about 16,500 species on the earth, and there's probably about 10,000 more to find. Ants, some of them are incredibly small, some of them are very large, some of them live tops of trees, deep underground, and so they are everywhere, and they're often difficult to find. They are a very ancient insect, and so the very first ants, and you can see pictures here on the screen, these are pictures of ants in amber. And almost 120 million years ago, the very first, what we recognize as ants, have been found. Some of them look entirely different than our current ants. Their jaws are differently placed, but they've been around a very, very long time. Where do they live? Pretty much almost every continent, and ironically not in Antarctica, so that's kind of funny. And they are extremely abundant. They comprise a very large percentage of the total biomass of animals. As you all know, there are more insects than any other kind of animal on Earth. There's more beetles than any other kind of animal. And ants, in that group of bees and wasps, they also make up a very large percentage. So they do live in this world of smell, even though they don't have a nose. Their antennae are incredibly efficient at picking up chemical signals called pheromones. And that pretty much runs the day-to-day world of an ant. If the ant is going to go fight or dig or go find food, protect the nest, it's all based on a chemical signal that they pick up with the antenna. So when you see them walking, kind of going from side to side, they're basically looking for that chemical smell, that tunnel. They exist in this interesting smell tunnel. And most are not well studied. However, the pest ants are. That's where the big money is. When I was at UCF studying ants, I was told you should go to University of Florida because they have a huge fire ant program there, but I didn't really want to do that, and so I stayed at UCF. But there's so much that we need to learn about pretty much the majority of ant species. A little bit more, people say, well, ants, oh my gosh, what good are they? They do a far greater job, in my opinion, than earthworms as far as soil enrichment, soil movement, all of the dirt that they dig in their where they live, they bring it up on top of the ground, they bring things down into the ground. So there's this constant movement of soil. There are also microbes that live in the ant nests specific to these nests, and they increase the decomposition rates in the soil. They disperse seeds in many places in Australia and some of the deserts in the Midwest. They are the ones that will go get seeds. Some of these seeds have little food packets on them. The ants will eat that, often bury the seeds. They are predators of a large number of other insects, and they are a major food source for a wide variety of animals. Those of you who know about the red-cockaded woodpecker in the southeast, they exist almost entirely on ants. There is some evidence of pollination, orchids primarily, but they do a pretty lousy job overall of pollinating flowers. They don't serve a good role in that, but they are an incredibly important part of our habitats. This is a picture of a harvester ant colony. The fellow on the right's named Schenkel, Walter Schenkel, and he perfected this method of pouring dental cement down into ant colonies and then basically excavating what the colony looks like, because there's really no way to sort of visualize what that looks like. And so with with a lot of care, you pour that down, dig around it, and then you have what the colony looks like. And this is typical of a lot of ant colonies. Most of them go pretty deep into the ground. And this is over 6 feet tall just for that. So now we are at the point where there's poll question number 2. So I will stop sharing and hand it off.
Great. Well, we have a couple of poll questions here. Which ant has the most painful sting? And also, are the ants you typically see in nature male or female? And while everyone is answering these questions, I wanted to ask you one question that came in during registration. As you can imagine, people are very interested in fire ants and why they merely exist.
Well, so fire ants are a pest in the Southeast, and they are a pest in many islands in the Caribbean. They were from South America originally and were brought into the United States and other islands by people, by us. They were transported by accident in often dirt from plants that are imported. So when people ask that question, it's like, oh, you know, we have these fire ants here. Well, we're the ones that brought them in. They are a part of the habitat and ecosystem in Central and South America, where they are just one of, you know, thousands of other ants. But here, since they come from a habitat where they have natural predators, here in the United States, they don't. And so they're able to spread very quickly. So there's a lot of focus and energy spent on fire ants and fire ant control. I have a cool slide coming up about one method of that. So when the question is, do they serve a purpose here? They serve the same purpose as pretty much any other insect would. Believe it or not, things eat fire ants. There's lots of frogs that their bellies are full of fire ants. Some of the herpetologists can actually look in their bellies. So, however, they also cause major issues with nesting sea turtles and birds. So they are a big problem. And so whenever people ask, the good and bad of anything, a lot of that is sort of relevant and related to what we want to protect. But they are a pain, and the best way to keep them out of your yard is to keep your yard as native as possible, because they do love disturbed areas. But that's a great question.
Well, great. Well, it kind of goes back to our poll question, and maybe you can answer this. I know that fire ants are not the most painful sting, but perhaps they're the only sting that we have felt here. Can you tell us which is the correct answer?
Yeah, so of that list, the fire ants are painful. What they do bring is quantity. They will crawl up your leg, and there is a pheromone, a chemical released, and numerous ants will sting you at the very same time. So carpenter ants don't sting you. They spray with their, they have a little nozzle. They'll bite you, cut your skin, and spray. It doesn't hurt as much as a fire ant. A velvet ant is actually a wasp. It's a female wingless wasp, and it is painful. But the bullet ant, and I've got a slide of that later, has been named the most painful ant. It's incredibly, it's a big ant, and it delivers a lot of venom. Most things in the tropics, most stinging insects pack a pretty good punch because there's so many things out there that want to eat you. So it has a really strong sting.
Oh, great. I did see something about the bullet ant that the sting can last like 24 hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So a little bit of hydrocortisone is not going to remove that sting.
No.
Well, tell us about male or female. Which what gender do we typically see?
So this is great, and I love that it's close because, and you'll see this in the slide coming up, that most of the ants you see are female. Male ants only serve really one role in a colony, and that is to mate, and then they die. They don't do any digging, any foraging, getting food, nothing. They just exist to mate and die. And so mostly all the ants that you see, the day-to-day ants on the sidewalk and everything, they're all female. And so every single bit of work that's done is done by the female ant.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm going to let you get back to your presentation, and we'll save the rest of the questions for the end.
Very cool. All right, let me get back to sharing here. And I will start right from here. All right. So, Lowndes, can you see that okay?
Yes, I got it.
Cool. So, great segue into this slide. So, a typical ant colony, and there's all kinds of variations, consists of a queen, and there could be multiple queens. And this queen lays eggs. The eggs turn into larvae. The larvae are basically the part of the colony that can eat solid food. larvae have these jaws, and so when you see ants bringing things underground, they're bringing it to the larva. The larva will crunch and chew and digest, and then it turns into what's called pupa, which then the ant forms within that shell. And depending if it's a fertilized egg, then that turns into a worker ant, which is female. If the egg is not fertilized, it turns into a male. So the male ants have half the number of chromosomes of a female ant. And then depending on what that female ant larva is fed, it can be a larger size worker, it could be a queen, or it could be a smaller size worker. And within this colony structure, there's also a cycle of when you first hatch out. You're underground, it's dark. Your first job is basically caring for the other ants in the nest, the larvae, the eggs. As you get a little older, your jobs get more dangerous. You become then assigned to digging functions. And then as you get a little older, you can go outside and forage for food. Then toward the end of a worker ant's life, they basically are put to the defense of the colony. And so it's really cool. They call it a temporal distribution of your work. So as an ant gets to the end of its life, the older female ants, their last job is the most dangerous job, where they could be eaten or killed. So where we send our young people out to fight wars, ants send their older grandmothers out to basically fight. And it works pretty well for that colony structure. There's all kinds of variations, but that's the basic colony structure of an ant colony. And so this picture shows you these are both the ants, the same species of ant. The genus is called Phodoli, which means thrifty in Greek, actually. And so give you an idea of the same larva can become a different ant if fed differently. So again, both of these are female. We call the bigger ones sometimes soldier ants, but the more proper term is called majors and then minors. Ants and culture. So there are so many movies and stories that involve ants. We're all fascinated by ants, from the fables of the ant and the grasshopper, Aesop's fable on the lower right, where the ants, are industrious and work hard, and the grasshopper fiddles away the day, to the horror movie Them, which I loved as a kid, giant ants, that was the best. Bug's Life, and then more recently Ant-Man, which was a comic in the 60s and now is on the big screen. But what's interesting, what you just learned about the gender of ants, we still want to put a lot of the male gender onto these lead characters. In Bug's Life, Flick was the main character, voiced by a male actor, although there were, of course, women in the roles as the queen. Ant-Man, they got a lot of things really right in that, the very first movie where they showed the ants and the species. They were right on. But when the character lead rides the winged ant, he gives the ant a male name, but of course it's a female. And so it's an interesting thing where we still, and I don't, that's a whole other discussion of sort of gender bias towards some of these. But in hindsight, that would have been a great move for Marvel to have basically, this great female hero. But there's all kinds of stories that in the 1800s, and I have a picture of it at the end, there was tons of books made geared toward children about ants and how they live their lives. So here was mentioned earlier the bullet ant. And Lowndes, you mentioned 24 hours. That's the name. The local name is Hormiga 24, or 24-hour ant. It's called the bullet ant. Parapanera clavata is the scientific name. And you can see the picture in the upper left. That is a big ant, and you can see that stinger. And by the way, the stinger is a modified egg tube. So all female ants sting. Male ants don't have that, so male ants cannot sting you. So that is a pretty big and painful ant. And so this tribe in the Amazon rainforest, one of their rite of passage ceremonies is they'll go and find these colonies. They typically nest the bases of trees, apply a little smoke, weave them into that glove like an oven mitt. And as you become a man, you have to put your hand in that mitt. And what you see, what looks like little olives, those are all of the abdomens containing the stinger pointing in toward that mitt. So you put your hand in, and you've got to hold your hand in there for a certain amount of time and show no pain. I can't imagine what that feels like. It's got to be insanely painful. But yeah, here's an example of where this ant is a part of a culture. There are what we call zombie ants as well. So, and this happens to a lot of insects where there's a fungus that will invade the insect and grow inside the body and eventually pop out like a little mushroom from when the fungus eats pretty much all it can. That mushroom pops out and then pops up on top, spreading more spores. But the fungus will alter the behavior of the ant so that the ant basically walks around like a zombie, will climb to the top of a grass stem or stalk, clamp on, and die. And that's when that mushroom component pops out of the head and spreads spores. But this is common in a lot of insects. But it's really fascinating how it takes over basically the ant and makes it do its bidding just to spread more spores. So as was mentioned before with fire ants, yeah, there are pest issues with ants. Fire ants cause $1 billion a year in damages, probably more. They do sting. The invasive ants outcompete native ants, especially in seed dispersal or even like nesting areas. They do impact nesting birds and sea turtles. And some invasive ants will tend the pest true bugs. You've heard of citrus greening, which is caused by another insect. There's some evidence that some invasive ants will actually take care of them. So the advice I give to everyone is try the best you can in your yard. Keep your native ground cover, keep your native soils best you can, because your native ants are the best way to prevent fire ants from coming into your yard. There's all kinds of, things I've heard, grits and boiling water and things. But really, at the end of the day, trying to keep your yard as native as you can is the best way. Native ants will outcompete fire ants if it's not disturbed. This is really cool. So where the fire ants come from in South America, there's a fly called a phorid fly, P-H-O-R-I-D. You can see it in the lower left picture hovering above the ant. We have them here in North America. It's a common fly around the world. And what they do is they hover around these ants, these fire ants, and they will try to lay an egg that then is inside the body of the ant. The little fly larva hatches and eats inside the ant body as the ant is still alive, and eventually finds its way to the head capsule of the ant. And then when the larva is full, ready to pupate, it pupates inside the head capsule of that ant. And then you can see in the lower right, that's a fly coming out of the mouth of that ant head. So it's really cool. The little ant head just pops off once the head is all filled with that fly. So these flies they won't eat or they won't infect all the ants, but what it does, it makes the ants so nervous because they're all looking up that they don't produce as many queens or males. And so the colony size or the ability to reproduce gets reduced. But yeah, Google this and you'll see some really cool videos of this in action. And now just some really pretty pictures of ants. Are some ants bad and invasive and they do damage? Yes, but that's a small percentage of the number of ants in the world. And with the recent technology advance of taking really good pictures of ants, we now can see them. And to me, in my opinion, the full, beautiful grandeur. So this is an ant called Acanthognathus. It's actually very small. You can see the size bar on the bottom. And it eats tiny insects that are found in logs and leaf litter. A beautiful ant. This is an ant that it's related to fire ants, but it's tiny, and it's called Solenopsis enigmata, and enigma. And it was, I found this with my good friend Mark Dayrup, who were in Dominica, and it basically exists as a queen that invades other ant nests and actually latches on to the queen of that nest by those jaws in the lower right and cuts the head off of the queen and then lays her eggs. And so the host workers basically take care of the eggs that she lays, which then turns into other queens and males. So it's a really cool parasitic ant, which has done away with a lot of the other colony structure. This is a cool ant called Polyrhacus, which is found in Australia and some places in Indonesia. And it has these fishhook spines all over its body. And so it's thought that these spines are a way that birds will have a hard time eating that ant, because you can't imagine trying to eat that. Honeypot ant, these are in the western United States and also Australia. So these ants are in deserts where there's not much rain and there's not much food. And so when there's rains, when there's nectar from flowering plants or other insects that will actually suck the juices of those plants, these ants will go and harvest a lot of that. And they'll feed it with their, they have these group stomachs called crops, and they'll feed it to these members of the colony. And all they do is they hang underground like that, filled with the nectar. And they just basically exist as wine casks. They just hang out. So then when times are very dry and there's no food, the other ants will go to those and say, you know, hey, could I have some food? Thanks. And they'll share food. So are these good to eat? Yes, they are good. And there's all kinds of tales from indigenous cultures that when you see these colonies, you know that about a foot under the ground is an entire chamber filled with these little juicy nectar-filled grapes. And so I've had them. That's not me, but I've had them and they do taste good. There's another group of ants called turtle ants that their heads are modified to be discs, and they live inside twigs. And so the head basically acts like a door. So you've got members of the colony, that's all they do, is they're basically doors. And so they'll pop the head up, and when another ant comes by and signals with its antenna and it recognizes the smell, the head will back away and it will go in. Really cool ants. I've seen these in my trips to Mexico. There are some in Florida. I think these are just awesome. These are also very cool bulldog ants, or jack jumpers, from Australia. And they have gigantic eyes. They're very aggressive. There's tales of, if you walk by one of their colonies and your shadow passes over the colony, they'll come out and they'll actually jump, try to chase you down. They're pretty big sized and extremely venomous. They have a pretty powerful sting. And then you've heard of army ants. And so there are army ants in Africa, and those are the ones in the upper left, often called driver ants. And then the army ants that are in Central and South America that you may be more familiar with on the upper right, that's a soldier or a major with giant sickle mandibles. And you can see the eyes, as was mentioned earlier. On the left, the driver ant has very reduced eyes, not even very functional. And you can see the army ant on the right, just one tiny little eye on each side. And then on the lower left, we actually have army ants here in the southeast. And so they are tiny. They mainly live underground, and they do their raids underground, burrowing through the soil to basically get at other ant colonies, barging into their nests and taking all of the eggs. And so a really fascinating group of ants. And then these are a group of ants called dacetines, which are, you can see the size bar, incredibly small. They're covered in hairs, which look like spoons or just like crazy hairs. And they have what looks like pretty vicious jaws, but remember, these are tiny. And so these ants eat springtails, which are even tinier insects that eat fungus and stuff in the leaf litter. These are fascinating ants as well. They move very slowly. You would never know them. You would never know that they're there. They often walk slow, and they're basically predators. These are the tigers of the undergrowth, looking for their springtail prey. So people ask, how do you identify ants? And it's tough. There's really not a great one book about identifying ants, but you can get a start by being familiar with your habitat and where you are and what the ant mound looks like. So these are common ants that you have in South Carolina. They range throughout most of the United States, and we call them cone ants. The colony looks like a cone, and they're very fast moving. If you have some on your fingers and you crush them, they have like a citronella smell. And actually, you want to see these ants if you don't like fire ants, because these cone ants do a great job. When the fire ant queens disperse from the colony, these cone ants do a great job once they land of killing them. They drag them into the colony and feed them to their young. And this is what a cone ant looks like up close. really cool, beautiful ant. Moves very rapidly. So if you're walking along the same bit of land and it's like a scrub or like a sandy area, if you see these half moon shaped mounds, these are our own leafcutter ants. So I'm sure you've heard of leafcutter ants in the tropics, where they will like take a whole tree, defoliate a whole tree in one night. We have leafcutter ants, but they're tiny, and they actually grow their fungus on caterpillar poop. For the most part, they will take some flowers and stuff, but their fungus really comes from all of those moths that are in oak trees and other hardwoods that just do there's just hundreds and hundreds of moths attacking these oak trees, and the caterpillar poop rains down from these trees. So these ants go and get it and bring it underground. This is what they look like. So that's the worker on top, the male in the left, and the female, the queen, on the right. And you can see, for the most part, for the male and or for the male and the queen ants, the males typically have smaller heads, much bigger eyes. The queens themselves are much more larger. So this colony, this mound, you'll see, especially in the southeast, is our own native harvester ant, and it's very flat. And it has these rings of charcoal all around it, and there's still a lot of argument as to why these ants do that. They will go out to burned areas, find charcoal, put it around the ring, but they'll keep it clear. If you put charcoal right there next to the nest, they'll pick it up and drop it to the outside. No one really knows why they do it, but it's something to look for when you see, oh, these ants. And that is a close-up picture of the head of one of the harvester ants. These have painful stings as well, but they're incredibly docile. You really have to pick one up, insult it, get it mad for it to sting you. And so this is a good example too of some of the names, the scientific names of these ants. This one is called Pogona myrmex, which means bearded ant, because you can't see it here, but under its or behind its jaws, it has all these hairs, and it uses basically to help carry sand as it's digging its nest. And this, of course, is a fire ant mound. We know it. You see it by the side of the road. You see it in grassy areas. The fire ants will often make their mounds much larger toward the winter time, because it's trying to get the sun's rays onto that mound. And fire ants, if you were to knock it over with your hand, you'll see large pupa in there. They make queens and males constantly. It's one of the reasons why they're so successful. And that's a close-up of the fire ant. You can see the stinger at the end of its abdomen as well. And its scientific name, the genus is Solenopsis, but the species is Invicta, which of course means invincible. So great species name for that. But even the fire ant, you look at that real close, it has its own little beauty to it as well. So what do ant people look like when they're outside? So I've had the pleasure of working with E.O. Wilson on a couple of ant trips, and that's Ed there on the right, kneeling down at the bottom of that pine tree. And so if you are walking through the woods and you see people doing this, kneeling down on the ground, there's like a bucket, there's maybe a sheet. Here's another picture. You will never see an ant person's face. You'll see their butt, you'll see their back, and we always joke about that. That's how we recognize some of our ant friends, is by what they look like from behind, because they're all looking down. And that is a very excited group of folks there. And there's some pretty well-known entomologists there. Roy Snelling, who has passed away on the far right with the hat, but because we're all looking down and digging. And so this is me. See, you only would recognize me from the top of my head, and I am in action right there. And you can see I've got something that I have. This tube goes to my mouth, and there's a bag over there to my right or your left. So what's in that bag? Good question. So this is a typical, ant hunting bag that I carry when I go look for ants. Hey, Nature Conservancy trowel there. So basically, we go out and try to find ants in habitat, and that's a challenge because ants are typically hidden. They are either underground, they're either in stems, they're either under bark, sometimes they're inside acorns. And so when you look for ants, you've really got to do a good job of pulling them out and actually collecting them. People ask, oh my gosh, you have to kill the ants? And the answer is yes. And so from a scientific standpoint, we collect the ants, we mount them on a pin, put a label, so then we can get a good feel for where these ants live, their distribution. And this right here is a sort of, this is kind of what I use. So I have a trowel to dig into the nest. I have that garden tool, which is really awesome to go into rotten wood, a saw for cutting into limbs, and then a nice pair of shears for splitting, thicker limbs. Some bags there called whirl packs for the ants that are in twigs. And then those of you old enough to remember, those are plastic film vials on the upper right, which happens to fit this, which is the ant sucker. And so this has gotten me a lot of questions when I would bring it into airports in my bag, and people would ask, what is that? Are you going to a convention in San Francisco? No, it's not a bong, but this is an ant sucker, which basically the metal end put on the ground next to ant colonies, the tube I actually suck through, and then there's a screen in that cork stopper, which stops the ants from coming back up into my mouth. And it collects the ants, and then I put that into the film vial with rubbing alcohol, a little note of where I found them, and then we process them, hopefully, to put them on a label, and then they go into museums. But it's this doesn't stop the ants who spray instead of sting, though. When they spray in that tube, I can still get that, taste that, which is sometimes not very pleasant. So people are asking what books to read, and so that is a huge question. There is no great one book to go to get you into this world, but I do recommend Bert Hodobler and E.O. Wilson, these two books. The one on the right is a big 7-pound doorstop of a book that has a lot of information about ants. It's take it little bit by little bit. It's basically Ed and Bert open up their heads and everything is in there. It's really good. The Journey to the Ants is smaller, and it takes you on a more personal trip of their travels to go find ants, and that's really that. I would always recommend that as a sort of a way into it. And then there are just tons of books from all over the world. Here's one book from another good friend of mine, Daniel, all about army ants, and it's fascinating. He spends all his time studying army ants. Here's one about ants and plants, of course, in French. And which is a fascinating study of how a lot of the ants and plants have co-evolved over time. There's a book on the left just on ants of Florida, written by my good friend Mark Dara. There's a book on harvester ants. There's another one on pest ants, how to identify them. And actually, that little booklet is very handy because they did it in a way that showed you how an ant trail looks. Because that's the first question I ask. If you have ants in your house, I say, how fast are they? Or what did the trail look like? You can actually identify pest ants that way. And then I mentioned earlier, there's old books geared toward kids. The one on the left, Tiny Folks in Red and Black, is from 1888. The World of Ants, the Golden Library of Knowledge from the 60s. My first book as a kid in the 60s was a book similar to this, and it got me really interested in it. There are two websites I would recommend only because the first one, he is a photographer who lives in Texas who does beautiful pictures of ants. The one on the bottom, AntWeb, also has a lot of pictures of ants, but it's more scientific. The goal of AntWeb and Brian Fisher is to take a picture of every single ant species, which is an incredibly ambitious goal. But again, beautiful websites. And with that, I will stop and stop sharing.
Well, Zach, that was interesting and horrifying at the same time.
Excellent. That's my goal.
It got a little bit easier to digest as it went on, but I think when we were talking about the bullet ants and putting your hand in the glove, I can't imagine.
Well, and I'll say something to that too. I think, and as a big fan of insects, I think that some of the networks, when they show specials on insects and ants, they tend to go toward, because I've seen that on a couple of specials. This tribe, and here's this, and like you're going, oh my God, because it is, oh my gosh. But there's so much more that I find interesting about insects and ants that in no way are terrifying or horrifying, but we do tend to have these TV shows and specials that lean toward that. Like, everyone knows the praying mantis, eats her mate and all these things that it's like, well, yeah, but have you seen like an orchid mantis that is a perfect mimic of an orchid flower? It's like, that's beautiful. Or there's so many things that are, anyway, so that's just my little tiny pet peeve of some of these specials really are geared toward making you horrified. And it's like, they're just insects. It's like, they're cool on their own, and actually without them, and everyone knows, without bees, we wouldn't be here, or we would be eating different things. And so anyway, but yes, that's pretty cool.
Well, you were talking about black ants a minute ago, and there are two questions about black ants or ants in your kitchen, or I think just regular ants. The first one came in that someone asked that there was a huge amount of tiny black ants that just sporadically died on a sidewalk, and they hadn't, had any chemicals or anything else around. Is there any kind of suggestions you might have of the cause of such a random death trap?
Yeah, no, that happens. You don't know. So the whole thing about this world under your feet, there's a lot of the stuff going on below our feet we have no clue about. Ants often will have, they will often fight each other. It's not as often as people would make it out to be, but there are territorial wars, and some ants will just drive out other ants. Some of them will kill them. Without really knowing where that was or what happened, I suspect that might be what happened. And then sometimes funguses will get into ant colonies, and everything is based on chemicals and smells. When an ant's infected, it triggers another behavior in the colony for the worker ants to basically take out the garbage. And so that could also so that colony could have been infected, and then the worker ants in there, it triggered another behavior to literally dump all of the sick ants out, kick them out. And that's what could have happened too.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's all chemicals. They're not thinking per se. They're just sort of acting on what is the smell they're getting. And some of that's controlled by the queen too, whatever a smell is passed on. Interesting.
Well, the other black ant question was about ants in your kitchen. Mm-hmm. And that might be called sugar ants or ants that are just, constantly coming and seem invincible. Do you have suggestions for treating to get rid of those ants?
Yeah, number one, don't spray them, because what you're seeing, remember my, telling you that what you're seeing are the grandmothers. Those old ants, they're going to die anyway. So if you spray them, there's a queen somewhere who is just making more ants, more eggs, and she's just like laughing at you. It's like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. So what you have to do, which is very effective, is use liquid baits. And so you can buy them in Publix, buy them in any store, those little ant baits that look like roach baits. And so that's the best thing to do, but you got to be patient, because what that is, it's a stomach poison that gets spread because remember, ants share food. The queen has to eat. So how does she eat? She gets fed by her workers. And so eventually that poison gets to the queen. So the more, and I tell people, leave them. Don't kill any. Just put the bait down. And it does freak people out, because all of a sudden you're going to see a ton of ants. But eventually that will work, and that'll eliminate the colony. The more you spray, the more ants you get. So a lot of pest control companies won't tell you that. And so the baits are the best thing to do. And also just, clean counters. Ants are incredibly efficient at finding food. So make sure counters are clean, things are kind of wrapped up. You can make your own ant bait, because all those baits are boric acid and sugar water. And boric acid you can buy, I think in the pharmacies, it's for foot funguses, and it's not borax, it's boric acid. And you mix real sweet sugar solution, put some of that powder in there, and again, you want the ants to drink it. And that freaks people out, because when you put that down, you see how many ants you really have. But it may take a week, but yeah, that's the best. That's the best way.
Great. All right, we've got another question. What is the average lifespan of an ant?
It's a good question. There are some fire ant queens that can live 15 years. There are workers who live a week or 2 weeks, but for the most part, a month-ish. And as a kid, I had ant farms. I was one of those Uncle Milty's ant farms. And, you get shipped ants, which, of course, now I go, oh, my God, they're importing ants. It's like, But yeah, they didn't last more than a month, 2 months. So because there's no queen. So
Yeah. All right. Tell me, do you know anything about what TNC is doing to conserve ants or create better habitat where ants can do the good work that they do?
yeah, that's a great question. So to tie it back to the Nature Conservancy and conservation, if you support the Nature Conservancy and you support the acquisition of land, if you support the people that do the prescribed fires, the invasive control, then you're supporting ants, because ants are part of the larger habitat and ecosystem. If you begin to take elements of that away, begin to remove ants, or you don't, or you remove fire, or you have more invasives, then what's going to happen is the native ants that are there will be, extirpated by other ants coming in. And so the best thing you can do is support the Conservancy's goal of preserving and protecting land, and that includes, you got to, set it aside, but you got to burn it, and you got to do invasive control, whatever that process is that got you to that diversity. And so everything that's within areas that burns exists there because it burns. And so, yeah, definitely support TNC, and because it's all about that natural area. A lawn, or a golf course, places like that, you have far less native habitat. And so, you really got to preserve the habitat. There's no getting around it.
Absolutely. All right, back to some of these questions. Question about the wings. Do they use the wings, or are they just there to make them look pretty? Tell us about that.
That's a great question. So yes, they do. So there's a certain point in that colony life cycle that you begin to produce other queens and other males, and so they are born. They are both born with wings, and at a certain signal. Some of it's triggered by rainfall. Some of it's triggered by a message by the lead queen to say, "All right, the young queens and males, get out." And so they'll be herded toward the entrance, and they'll climb stems. The queens, they'll fly. The males, they fly. And they often will mate in the air. Sometimes they'll mate on the ground. And so once the male mates with the female, he dies. He doesn't live long. He's done. So the wings are there to get that male to the queens. The queen, once she's mated by one or several males, she'll hit the ground or look for a twig, and she will tear off her wings because they're done. And so as she starts a colony, she either digs a hole, goes into a twig somewhere. She subsists on the muscles that were powering those wings. So she'll basically utilize those carbs inside her body, because she has to lay eggs and she can't go out to get food. So the new eggs that hatch, they're very tiny workers. They go out and get food. So yeah, they do use wings just for that goal of getting away from where they are. They don't want to have a colony right next door, because then you're competing for food. So they have to disperse. They're not really good. They don't fly very far, but once they land, they can colonize pretty well.
Well, this one is kind of on the heels of that, airborne ants. So we've got someone that is sitting outside and having ants drop on them, particularly when they're sitting around the pool. Is there a certain season that you might have more airborne ants?
Yeah, rainy season. Yeah, the rainy season. That's typically triggered by rains out west. You have massive swarms of ants because there's not a lot of rain. Down here in the southeast, during the summertime. And pools especially are just more attractive to ants. I don't know why, maybe the higher humidity, but you find tons and tons of ants. Or it just could be that you can see them in the water and see them in the skimmers. But yeah, after rains, during times of high humidity, you'll have these tiny ones that live in the medians of the road. They'll swarm up, and they're very, very small. You can walk through a whole cloud.
Oh. Interesting. Okay. There is someone here who has some large black ants, maybe a third of an inch. They're in the woods around there, and they sting. Do you know what type of ants these might be?
If they're large, and it depends where you're coming from in the country, but they sound like, if they sting, they could be something called trap-jawed ants, which are pretty decent size, and they do sting. But if it's like a carpenter ant or a bull ant, they will hurt. You may think it's a sting, but they'll bite you and they'll squirt the acid onto you. So I'm guessing it's going to be carpenter ants, because they're very common And they're big and they're all over the place.
Interesting. All right, let me see if we've got any more questions here. We talked about ants are being all around the pool. Let's see. Are there any endangered ants? You know, we've got endangered just about every other type of, you know, living species. But are ants or insects, are there any rare or endangered types of ants?
Yeah, it's the rarity with insects is often tough because you can have a rare insect globally, but it could be very common locally. And a lot of that goes to the uniqueness of the habitat. So as an example, in Florida, the Nature Conservancy has a beautiful place called Tiger Creek Preserve. Highly recommend people going there if you're in Florida. And it basically has these rare Lake Wales Ridge habitats, which were once the sea dune, you know, the dunes when the sea level was high. So just by the nature of its being an island type habitat, the plants and animals are very rare. And so are the insects. There are some flightless beetles, and there's an ant there that is a cone ant, but it's an entirely different species of cone ant found nowhere else. But when I go there, they're everywhere. They're common as dirt. It's like, oh my gosh. But because TNC bought the land and maintained the fire, it's open. The insects are thriving. We have people come and give us assessments on how those species are doing. So yes, there are rare insects and ants and potentially endangered ones, but it all comes back down to the habitat. Madagascar, where a good friend of mine has done some work, it is just lousy with ant species. He went on one trip where he was just naming so many, he was running out of names because here's a new one, here's a new one. But Madagascar has also a lot of pressure on its habitat. And so same thing, we got to preserve habitat because what we're saving are the things that we don't know. And the things that we don't know will probably, you know, are of benefit to the whole habitat. So it's a great question.
Well, great. Well, we are coming to a close. I wanted to see if anyone's got a couple of extra final thoughts or questions. But as we are getting out of here, wanted to put up this last screen. I hope that you all will keep in touch. Zach is open for you if you want to learn more or get perhaps some other resources to learn more about ants. He's happy to connect.
Yeah, send me an email. I mean, there's so much. It's so tough to give a general answer. So please send me, and I see some more stuff coming in the chat. So if you don't mind, my email is there. Send me questions.
Yeah, that is great. And please stay connected with us. We've got some other webinars that are coming up. One of our other chapters, Tennessee, is having a gory science webinar next month. And if you're interested, send me an email, Lowndes McDonald. My email is right there, and I'll be happy to send you that information as well. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. We would love to have your support and hope that you'll stay connected. But please answer these exit polls as you are logging off and stay in touch. Thank y'all so much.
Yeah, thank you all. This is a great opportunity. And yeah, send me some questions. I love the question about, do they taste different? My quick answer to that is yes. And I have tasted lots of them. They do taste. That's how I identify some. So great questions.